2020 was a tumultuous year. The question we must all ask going forward is simple. What values, ethics, and behaviors from the old world are we going to preserve? And what new perspectives are we going to embrace as we build our future civilizations? This is the New World Podcast with Areez, Khaki, and Akeel Samji. Hello and welcome to the New World Podcast. This is our first installment. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm your co-host Akeel.
I'm your other co-host, Areez, Khaki.
And today we're just going to do a deep dive into the background, context, and motivations behind our podcast and the brand New World. So let's begin. Areez, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So hello, everybody. Welcome to the first episode. Akeel did a pretty good job doing the kind of introduction as to what to expect today. Yeah, so a bit about myself. Let's see. Well, we all know that 2020 is kind of a weird year. We all, I guess, we're at home in some sense. I think that's a weird question to ask anymore. Like, it's more like a funny thing to go down the street. It used to be that you'd be at a random bus stop or an informal conversation. You start off with, "Hey, how was your day? What did you do? Anything new?" It's like same thing. Yeah, but anyways, at the current moment, I'm a student at the University of Toronto, second year. I'm studying bachelor's in life science, but more specifically, I have a double major in biology and health studies, and pursuing the intersection between, more importantly, my interest lies in genetics, mostly genetic engineering, but at the same time, also very interested in how health systems work and evolutionary history, kind of something that I find very interesting in terms of the origin of species and life. It's pretty interesting. How about yourself?
And yeah, so now I'll talk a little bit about myself. I'm also a post-secondary student attending Carleton University for sustainable and renewable energy engineering. My goal is to work on different modes of transportation and find new renewable energy sources. So just like, for example, Tesla does electric vehicles, I want to play off that and move towards like solar and wind energy vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Areez, now why don't you tell us a little bit about your formative years and what brought you here today?
Yeah, sure. I guess that's a pretty good starter. Let's see, formative years. Well, I can probably start off by talking about like a bit of background in terms of, obviously we're filming this from Canada, so I'm a Canadian for those of you not wondering. Let's see. Well, I grew up in Markham, so it's kind of like a suburban town off the coast, literally off the coast of Toronto. And yeah, most of my formative years were spent over there. Like as every child would. I never basically. I always had my interest lying in about like science. I kind of had this wonderful obsession with like dinosaurs when I was a kid. Like I really liked the movie Jurassic Park. Used to watch that a lot. Be obsessed with it. I also had this very fun kind of enthusiastic approach, not just to science, but to reading and kind of understanding people and history sometimes. So then that was kind of like a weird mashup between history and science. And then I moved to Toronto, and then did middle school and high school over here. In high school, I would say my favorite my favorite subject areas to study were probably biology and the intersection with biology and more particularly the genetic processes within like cells. So of course I mentioned that that's my current area of study too. That was also like what I found interesting back in high school as well. Also got involved a lot in high school in student council and a bunch of other endeavors. And I guess we can sort of understood the importance around the time of high school as to how different the job market was becoming.
For sure, yeah.
Because I think one of the things that I guess we try to aim as we were speaking off camera is that with this podcast, you're trying to, I guess, give Gen Z, which is our generation, a bit more different perspective on how to approach certain conventions the way we're taught versus the way it actually is in reality, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So for myself, I would say in high school, in my formative years, I had the luck of being mentored by very smart people who essentially informed me that the best way to kind of build your network would be LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
And that might seem obvious now, but in retrospect, I don't think there were many high schoolers building LinkedIn, right? And the idea was to kind of build a brand, be associated with a bunch of smart people, and market yourself not just as an individual, as a student, but as yourself as a brand, which I think we're also going to allude to today as well, which is the idea that like everyone is a brand at this point. I think if you're not posting, if you're not doing something that you're interested in, or even if you're not doing something like directly involved, maybe a business or a project, you have to understand that the way you market yourself at this point is crucial, I think, in the job process. And now in the ever more competitive world, it's becoming more crucial. Yeah. So anyway, going back to my formative years, once I graduated from high school, I went to university. Yeah, that's pretty much it where I am right now. And I guess we're starting off the podcast over here
For
in
sure,
terms
yeah.
of, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, what about like your formative years? Like, really?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Toronto. I went through like the whole school process. Actually, me and Areez did go to the same high school, but we've met from a long time before that. Pretty much since we were born, we've been friends.
Yep.
Yeah, but for me, climate change has really interested me ever since I learned about it in elementary school and the problems behind it. I really wanted to do something about it, and I am, as you can say, a car guy, like a fanatic of cars and vehicles. And so, seeing as that was my favorite topic, but also knowing that cars are a leading method of pollution and towards climate change, that's something I wanted to focus on, which is why I'm focusing on that in post secondary.
Very good. In terms of your like high school experience, was there like any? I know you just mentioned that you were a car guy. Has this interest of cars been like since like the beginning? And like, what was the like internal motivations? Like, of course, like when we were all kids, we all like dreamt of like being an astronaut or one day opening up our own garage and being an auto mechanic. Like, was this like a childhood kind of thing? Were you obsessed with cars from childhood, and then did that like actually become the reality? Because a lot of us, all of us say in spirit that we want to become astronauts or whatever. Did that actually is that really what happened? Or
Yeah, it pretty much was. When I was a little kid, I think I had 2 bucketfuls of toy cars, like little Hot Wheels, and I used to play with them a lot. And just growing up and seeing people driving cars, that's always something I wanted to do. Funny thing enough, when I was a little kid, I used to think cars used to drive themselves, and now that's actually becoming a reality, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, like I've always wanted to drive since I was a little kid too, and just work on cars, do things with cars and vehicles. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's pretty cool. Yeah, so as we both mentioned, this is kind of like where we reach to like the modern day, which is like essentially our formative years, and not just that, but rather our motivations for starting this podcast, as we just mentioned, a few things in terms of personal brand, which is just like the kind of the surface level as to why we started this, and then the goal of the episode is to kind of give you an introduction behind the podcast, really from an informal perspective, to kind of, I guess, familiarize ourselves with our audience and our audience to kind of establish a sense of trust. I think one of the mistakes that I think some podcasters, or maybe if this idea of like influencers in like an umbrella term, do is people say that some people are out of touch, and I think it's because influencers or podcasters or like these so-called like IG people, social media people, display a sense of like lifestyle or talking points, stuff like that. That's not really relatable to the common man, which is why I think we're going to talk about why podcasting is so successful, which is what I think that's our hypothesis as to why we believe that people like Rogan are getting more views when it comes to talking about complex issues than people like CNN or just random people, celebrities on social media who are out of touch with everything entirely. Yeah. So with that, we would like to talk about getting to the next topic, which is our motivations behind starting this podcast. And even in our notes, we've kind of like we spoke about this earlier, and we basically summarize this into one single number. This is probably going to be everyone's favorite number on this in this podcast. Ready? It's called 2020. 2020 was like a weird year in terms of basically everything. We saw a lot of things that we took for granted all of a sudden just like come to a halt. We really didn't know what to expect, right? Like we didn't know that. I mean, we knew that this thing was happening. I'm not going to mention it because YouTube rules, but and everyone knows what I'm talking about. But that this thing that spread from China essentially stopped the entire world in its tracks, and so we all kind of had to shift our lives a bit in terms of our lifestyles, in terms of our approaches, and how we began to really rethink the way we appreciated each other, like in family-wise and family material relationships, and how I think all of us are going through like this existential questioning period of like fundamental values and really what's important, what's not important to us, and stuff like that. I think that's where we kind of began. That's where the motivation lied, but it really didn't come together until I guess we met up and kind of popped the idea with each other. Or do you think that it was because, as the audience knows, like in terms of podcasting and being a medium of conversation, do you think it's because we were having conversations that you thought you wanted to share with the rest of the world?
Yeah, like I also wanted to learn a lot about future technologies, which we're going to touch upon later in this episode. And when Areez brought the idea to me of starting a podcast, I realized that was a way I could hold myself accountable to learning things, because now I have to learn things to be able to explain it to the listeners, to you guys, and be able to write notes and just really understand it overall.
Yeah, it's like the listeners keep us accountable to what we say. Yeah. Yeah.
And also too, just like the rest of you guys, we were always under like lockdown, just staying at home and just not having much to do. And the podcast gave me something to do other than just sit at home and play video games and watch TV. Like,
Yeah, there's a sense of maybe we can actually allude more to that and maybe let the audience know, just to familiarize you guys with us more so you can relate to us. There's a sense of relatability. On a scale from 1 to 10, how hard do you think it was starting this podcast? Like in terms of like all the work we put into it.
I'd say maybe like a 7 or 8.
Yeah.
Especially too, we ran into a lot of technical problems with our previous like cameras and things like that. Like unforeseen circumstances which really delayed us. Luckily, we were prepared and had backups, so it worked out in the end.
Yeah. Like I mean, it's given in principle that like we learn about businesses and we know that businesses are hard to maintain, but I didn't really know like how massive like there was like work to be done in terms of like forms for taxes, like trade, copyright, like a bunch of stuff, logo creation, and like, oh my gosh, this logo is not fitting this dimension, and then you would try to do it, and then you would run into a problem because now it looks ugly. like there's so much of those like tiny kind of micro steps that really, in retrospect, when we look at another brand, we kind of like are so quickly to criticize or like jump towards conclusions and realize that when you start your own business, you realize, okay, there's like a huge burdensome you have to like as it takes. So it was a pretty interesting process, I think, of learning. Like this is not our first like moment of working on a brand. Of course, we've both had prior experiences of working on like whether it be like companies in high school or like endeavors or brands or volunteering experience or whatever. But this was the first time I would say when we were like literally like the co-founders at the core, like we're the co-hosts, and we were like thinking about this in retrospect, like, oh my gosh, like this is us doing it. So, like literally, there's a clean slate. Like New World Podcast didn't exist before, and now it does, and now it's up to us to build whatever New World Podcast is, right? Yeah. Before you look at a brand, you think, oh, I'm getting a job at an established company already, and it's like someone else is running that company. But now it's like, no, it's not another company. This is you guys. This is us. So that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, like, me and Areez do have prior experience with extracurriculars through running businesses. There was a program called Junior Achievement in Toronto, which allowed us to connect with different high schoolers and really just start a business for a couple of months. But comparing that to what we're doing now is totally different. Like now I understand why different businesses have different sectors, like, marketing, sales, and finance. I never really understood that in the beginning because I was like, oh, this is so simple. I could probably just do like 3 of these things myself. But looking at it now, I realize how much work each department takes, and doing that by yourself gets really complicated.
Yeah, and it goes to the whole startup culture that we both are really interested in terms of innovation, like primarily because both of us are in STEM fields, and so we're heavily involved in like innovation. We're heavily keeping up with track, and our goal eventually one day is to work in some of these leading companies, or who knows, maybe start one ourselves. But in terms of like the startup culture thing, do you think that, like, especially with podcasting now, it's becoming so democratized in terms of startup, it's funny like how you have to wear like multiple hats at once. Like a title really doesn't mean anything in a startup. Like you kind of like a CEO or CFO, but in reality the CEO is probably also like the CTO, and then the CFO is like literally chief production officer, not just a financial officer. Like
even marketing too.
Yeah, like it's weird. It was weird, kind of like wearing all these hats at the same time. But then you look at it and you're like, this is how all startups started, right? It's like this is the humbling part, which is like you have to wear multiple hats, and there's a sense of like we've heard of this, like perfection versus progression. I think I don't think we made this mistake as much, surprisingly, and maybe it's because maybe I'm also humbling ourselves too quickly, but I don't think we aimed for perfection. I don't think we're still aiming for progress over perfection, right? Obviously, the first episode of this podcast and the first few episodes are going to let us get off of our feet. But at the same time, over time, we're going to improve. We're going to be able to release a bit more quality content along with guests and whatever in the long term. What do you think that that makes much more sense? That was our approach, or do you think we or maybe all of us aim for perfection eventually and we get humbled over time? What do you think we went through?
Yeah, honestly, we were just trying to start, to be honest, and get off the ground. And no, we weren't aiming for perfection at all. Exactly. We were just aiming to get a video captured and get some audio recorded and see how it sounds, see how to upload it onto YouTube and everything, and just really start it.
Literally building a brand. And which is like going literally to our next point, which is like why podcasting? Why particularly, like, you may be asking, okay, like, sure, you guys are super relatable, and who knows, maybe someone listening to this or watching this, maybe you're in university as well, and you're saying, I'm either the same age as these guys, 1 year younger, and I'm a few years older. Like, what's different between me and you? And like, well, the truth is, like, if it's literally coming down to like academic background, there's really not that much difference. However, it was this idea that we had, this idea of a brand, this branding, and starting a business that differentiates us. And so the idea of podcasting, I think, which is we're working on in terms of why we started a podcast, is it gives a chance for people to actually meet people like face value. I think one of the things that we saw this year, and maybe our audience can relate to this, is we saw this sort of failure of our old world institutions, as I like to call them, like the idea that we got the name New World from this sort of play on words with the old world. And for those of you listening and watching, what we classify as the old world, and you're going to hear us use those two terms interchangeably, the old world and the new world. And the reason we call ourselves the new world is, as we mentioned before, our initial motivation was coming out of 2020. And we saw a lot of the institutions, whether you want to call them institutions or like, I guess, taken for granted sectors. That's what I call them, or taken for granted like things and areas or sectors of public discourse, whether it be media or whether it be government, in fact. We saw a lot of these conventional systems kind of not even like fall, but actually collapse in crisis overnight. And I think that's where we kind of saw podcasting take its place, right? I think many people found their kind of happy balance and their peace listening to many people got into podcasting in terms of starting one and listening to one. And all these podcasters became super like watchable. People were spending lots of times on YouTube and lots of time on YouTube. And for the first time, people began to actually search up I think for the first time on scale began to search up educational content, right? The more than just consuming the average passive content that you watch on YouTube, which is a good thing in a way because people are actually gaining knowledge on something that they find entertaining and valuable at the same time. Like people like Joe Rogan and his like 100 million Spotify deal shows that there's potential within this space. Yeah. And so we went into this idea of podcasting coming from a place of humility and understanding that this is probably where the trends are headed. And that another motivation of ours was literally because we saw this like epic failure of especially mainstream media and this sort of onslaught of PR or just negativity all day. And to us, like, was it sickening to you on like a scale of like 1 to 10? Like it was turning, or even like social media too. Like you'd be surprised because like social media, the whole idea was that to replace the mainstream media. But I felt like those were literally the two sides of the same coin. Do you think that like how on scale of 1 to 10, how depraved do you think like life was, especially in the beginning months of this crisis?
Oh, for sure, like 100%, like a 9 or 10. Just because everything was so new, didn't really know what was going on and like what to expect from the future. And it's just as many of you were, just like sitting at home, not doing much. And just, it made me feel like I felt like doing nothing. I was just
like it was so isolating. And then on top of that, as we moved further into it, we saw like so much unrest. We saw like insane events happening worldwide.
For sure, yeah.
Like we saw people like so many issues as a result of this, and these were all issues that stemmed from either trends that were already happening that were exacerbated by COVID and like the lockdowns. But I mean, it's insane to think about like how much the mainstream channels of the way we get information were a big contributor to why people began to react, I guess, in a bad way.
And that's why, we wanted to start podcasting too, because even if you look at news interviews, for example, they interview people for maybe like 10 to 15 minutes and they don't really go in depth on any topic. And as soon as they run out of time, the topic's over and they move on to something else. But with podcasting, we have the ability to spend, like an hour, 2 hours into a topic and really dive deep and help not only us, but you, the listener, understand what we're talking about. Right?
Yeah, and with this first episode, we're literally coming from a simple place of just informality, establishing kind of friendly boundaries, like telling you what you guys can expect from us, what we expect from our audience in terms of you guys being able to be attentive listeners and giving us continual constructive feedback as to what you'd like about the first episode. So just please be going easy on us because we all are in this together in terms of progressing over time as a brand. Yeah, I guess going back to the mainstream media narrative, I kind of like that point that you brought up in terms of interviews, which is, I think, and this might be like just a hypothesis that I'm having, but I think the rise of podcasting as being a very popular medium is a result of the death of thinking that doesn't apply anymore. Like it's as if it's like landline technology in a post-cell phone world, because if we think about like the history of media, like we look at like newspaper, the printing press for like a while, then the TV came along, then you had these sort of correspondents, right? And it almost seems as if like correspondents are like celebrities. Like they're people that you see up there on the screen and you think they're relatable, but they're talking about certain stories. And then sometimes in interviews, you kind of tell that they're not genuine, they're kind of fake. And I think maybe podcasting is now the up and coming trend, not just for news, because you can get podcasts about news now.
Yeah.
You can get podcasts about political news, business news, tech news. There's podcasting for every single genre.
Yeah.
And it's literally allowing people to specialize in one niche that the media was traditionally supposed to cover.
Yeah.
And the media was supposed to be, whether it be just a check on government, but at the same time reporting on good news as well. Right? I think people in 2020 realized that the media is not their friend.
Yeah.
Right? I think we want to hammer that point home, which is the fact that podcasting or forget about podcasting at the moment, like sometimes whether it be social media or media as well, like traditional points of media, is not always like a pleasant place to be. I think we all know that at this point. We see the cons and pros and cons of both social media and mainstream media, and how it kind of has almost created this weird visceral reaction within everyone. Like you see a headline and you start to become enraged with like liquefied like blood, like your blood is boiling and everything. And that's probably the biggest error the mainstream media is making, that's empowering people like us and like the low budget startup individuals who really want to have a more rational, logical voice in the conversation, because everything today seems very depraved and very like emotionally charged, right? So I think maybe that's where we're coming from. That's why we think that podcasting has a unique space to fill, or a void to fill, for many people who traditionally look towards media, but now are kind of lost and tired and want to look for a more positive, more dialogue filled, more kind of informal, but at the same time educational.
For sure.
For sure. So Akeel, maybe you want to let our audience know what they could expect from this podcast. Like, are we just talking about like podcasting? Are we just talking about like societal issues? Are we talking about just like, are we going to even talk about tech? Because we're talking about the new world, so that's guaranteeing some sort of futuristic futurism kind of concentration on it. But is it just going to be very breathed, or are we going to try to like go in depth into each topic with regards to the new world, like on an entire scale?
Yeah, no, definitely try to go in depth as much as possible. We definitely want to cover like new trends, conversations, technologies, and even issues in society that arise in the future, just to explain it to you guys, because we want to cover it through the lens of Gen Z, which is the generation we're from. But that's not to say the other listeners who are not Gen Z can't relate. It's just to focus on our generation, because we're on this journey going into the future. And since we're looking at it through that lens, we can understand what to expect for the future. As well, we're going to talk about things such as like Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, blockchain, and just talking about what that really is. Especially hearing new headlines like Bitcoin hits an all-time new high. What does that really even mean? And as well, we'll also have Gen Z Spotlight episodes, which is where we interview someone from our generation who has started a business, their own civil society, etc., and just talking to them about what they experienced, has their high school experience or any education they've had relate to their experience that they're having now, and just really trying to explain for those of you who are undecided, to give you guys a point of view to look at.
Yeah, I think going before you move on, just touching base on that one point with regards to interviewing Gen Z leaders. That is something that we try to hammer home here at The New World as being very Gen Z oriented.
For sure, yeah.
I think that's part of our mission statement, which is to kind of concentrate all on Gen Z. That's essentially like our audience. And the point of, I think the motivations initially to start something like Gen Z Spotlight were to bring, again, once that relatability factor, right? Sometimes these podcasts, and it's a good thing that these podcasts have some high core, like high energy individuals that are like in their 30s and 40s, nothing wrong with that entirely. But sometimes it takes a sense of relatability from many different kind of traits, i.e., you see someone who's your age kind of helps a lot, right? You see someone who's like literally just your age or 1 year older than you who's achieved a degree of success. It kind of helps the credibility a bit. Sure. Like, okay, this process actually works. Like this trust, which I think is very important. So maybe would you like to kind of specify the mission statement here that we have at New World Studios?
For sure, yeah. So it's just, as I was saying before, looking at topics through the lens of Gen Z, just because we're on the journey with you guys as well. And we want to learn about the future topics as well too, and just understand what to expect as we move on to the new world. And we also want to learn like what topics and perspectives we want to take from the old world, and what perspectives from the new world we want to apply as we build our civilizations.
For sure. Yeah, and remember, like we're going to be touching upon technologies, but also be touching upon philosophies and political theories, along with wisdoms of the past. And I think we want to reemphasize that we're not here to kind of berate at the old world. We're not here to like kind of criticize every idea. Of course, in the future episodes, and when we're talking, most of our beliefs in terms of like the way we view the world come from a very come from ideas that have essentially been established for a while.
For sure.
This idea like free thinking and free speech and of freedom of and the individual rights and for individuals to carve their own path is simply a timeless idea, I think. And I think the future is built on individuals, not on groups of people. And I think that's another idea we want to hammer home, which is we want to encourage our each and every audience member as treating them as an individual. I think it's easy for us to say because majority of, and you always hear this with like celebrity, like to thank all my fans, right? Like or like to thank all the voters, or like we tend to forget that each of those voters, each of those fans is a unique person with a unique history, with a unique set of beliefs, who is literally a complex being in a universe inside of themselves, right? We always think of ourselves as being such complex beings, and we think of ourselves always looking at the collective. We tend to forget that each of those parts of the collective is an individual who he or she holds not just has the right to their own destiny, but at the same time is an amazing storyteller, has the ability to should have the right to tell their own narrative. And so like we want to essentially hammer that idea home, which that this podcast, The New World, emphasizes the idea of individuality and of thinking as an individual. And as Akeel mentioned, we're going to hopefully talk into much more about philosophies and particularly wisdoms and talking points that are essentially, we believe, have been kind of suppressed in the old world, but literally come from the old world, which is like this idea of like thinking objectively, thinking rationally, thinking logically, and approaching problems from first principles, which I think many of us today kind of make the error of not doing because we jump towards conclusions, or we're immediately, it's easy for us to kind of like cast other things aside that we don't understand, but we're not willing to engage with them and kind of debate, and we'll go back and forth about what could be the best option moving forward for any particular problem. Yeah,
and just going on to that as well, when you're looking at the podcast, you're going to see episodes with just me and Areez diving deep into topics, but you'll also see episodes where we have high profile guests talking about societal issues from the old world, such as objectivism or libertarianism, and hopefully we can deeply analyze that ourselves as well. But if not, hopefully our guests can cover it too.
And we encourage the goal of the podcast is to make it a free, as we just said, we value free criticism, free speech, individuality. So we encourage constructive criticism back at us.
For sure.
I know there's definitely going to be some on this episode because we're just starting out. But we're always encouraging it, and we don't have a restriction on what to say and what don't to say. We believe in the idea that like every individual's right to speech or their thoughts should be validated just as ours is, and that's the ability for us to have this microphone in front of us to be able to convey messages to you. Similarly to the fact that we believe that we have taken the risk ourselves to be hosts of the podcast, we've taken a financial business risk, an entrepreneurial risk, a venture to kind of build a brand around the idea of conversation for Gen Z about the future and the new world, and therefore we should extend that same right to our customers, which are technically our audience members. So yeah.
And that just leads to the whole power of conversation. Although you don't need to agree with everything we say, we just hope that you keep an open mind and just listen to what we have to say. Just to see new perspectives and just understand what's going on in the world and just taking that into account in your day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I think that's another thing that I wanted to hammer home about podcasting, which is why I think it's better. Because there's such a sense of like familiarity and relatableness, people tend to listen to just common folk talk. I think it's astonishing that some people still today cannot understand the concept of podcasting, particularly people who are in establishment media or corporate press or governments or this in industries where things like this didn't exist before. And it seems odd that there are people who can literally just get in front of a mic and a camera and build a brand from scratch on using social media, using the power of, I guess now we have open source communication. We can connect to everyone in the world now. And how it's astonishing for some of these people, which is essentially why we believe that podcasting is becoming so successful, is that the power of conversation is something that's not really new to us as our species, right? For thousands of years, we've either concocted narratives to kind of explain in terms of us growing up in tribes, or when we were hunter-gatherer societies, we needed storytelling. We loved the idea of telling anecdotes to motivate collectives, to motivate individuals to take action, right? As we said. So this power of storytelling, this need, I think, for storytelling is something that's like intrinsic within us. It's built in us as humans. And so the goal of conversation always is to understand the other, but at the same time to also do storytelling, right? It depends on the context of the conversation. Often, as Akeel mentioned, we're gonna have just us two talking back and forth, shooting ideas at each other, relating back to you as the audience, and we obviously know you're there as a third individual, as a collective. And so we're just rambling on about our ideas, we're throwing stuff at you, and we're kind of gonna expect you guys in the comments to kind of I guess, engage in your own dialogue and your own perspectives. But at the same time, whenever we have guests, whether they be the Gen Z leaders, thought leaders, or also high-profile guests, hopefully we have some amazing guests planned for you if that all works out. And the goal there is to storytell, because the idea is that we're featuring a guest, an individual, as we mentioned, an individual, complex individual who's lived life longer than we have, who's an expert in a particular topic, who has their own version of storytelling to the world to share. As we said, we believe in the right of every individual to storytell and the importance of being able to intellectually and rationally defend it and at the same time promote it as well, which is another thing that we stressed, the idea that like engaging in conversation doesn't have to always there's this kind of like stigma that conversation and like news media and like reading news and stuff is like something like, I guess, what like the elites of the elite do in terms of an educational perspective. But I think conversation can be very interesting to everyone, even when it's complicated, and it depends on how it's conveyed, I think. If it's conveyed in an anecdotal sense, there's something really intrinsic about it, whether it be like an evolutionary trait that all of us like love to kind of sit around the fire and tell stories. And I think there's something that people, our generation, are going to be very interested in listening to or watching on YouTube, for those of you that are watching, that are going to be interested in tuning in to figure out what this person's really trying to say. And how this back and forth between us two as co-hosts and our guest actually works. If there's any times that there's going to be debate between us as a co-host and the guest, or whether or not there's a point thrown back at us and we kind of have to think about ourselves and check ourselves where checking is required in terms of fact checking ourselves. Yeah, I think there's definitely a power of conversation. And it goes back to the idea of why conversation is important. And it goes back to something that I really want to declare to our audience right now, which is we were brainstorming at the start of this podcast journey what to talk about, how to approach conversation, and really which guest to book. Is there a sort of red line, or is there some sort of limit or barrier to what we can talk, who we should call, or what we should be talking about, and maybe or not this interferes with our particular niche or our particular topic. And we essentially kind of devised this weird concoction of ideas, but at the same time, something that's kind of a good thing to start any conversation with. And we essentially have called it our charter of speech. It's just a fancy name for some ideas or first principles to come into any conversation with. And essentially the idea goes, something that works like this. Is like when you're sitting down with someone who is a different individual than you and who believes something different than you, and even before that, maybe look at the individual and understand that that's another individual. Similarly to yourself, if you value human rights, if you value your own right to freedom of speech, freedom to live, freedom to do whatever you want, and having the liberty to do so, and having the freedom to break barriers and innovate and change the world, similarly, that should also be extended to the person in front of you. And I think more of the world could become less visceral and less violent if we kind of acknowledge that all of us have the capability of thinking deeply. And instead of using sort of like our mammalian like brain at the background trying to like fight and be visceral, we can sit down and think from first principles and say, okay, let me look at Akeel as the individual. Let me look at Areez as the individual. Not like, oh, I'm not going to talk to you, or I don't understand you, but I'm not going to bother to ask. And so the first principle is to look at the other person as an individual, as someone who is deserved of respect and dignity. And so always maintain conversation and dignity. And we're going to follow suit with these pledges ourselves, is that every guest that comes in, there's going to be debate. Mind you, not that the idea of dignity doesn't escape the criticisms of intellectual debates, right? We believe that anything not worth intellectually defending should not be defended at all. And so that's the whole idea of why conversation is important. And so we respect our guests, and therefore the idea of personal attacks goes away because we're treating them with dignity. Rather, we'll criticize the idea, not the individual. Next thing you should also maybe consider when talking is that not everyone that you speak to, whether it's a different topic or an expert or not an expert, everyone has the right to give their 2 cents. And even if someone is not an expert in a particular topic per se, and maybe the other individual that they're debating, or if you're debating someone, or if we're debating someone as our guest, it doesn't mean that because the individual comes from a place of authority, that their opinion, that the other person's opinion doesn't matter. I think, as we mentioned, in conversations, you should have the ability to defend something rationally and logically. Therefore, using facts and trying to convince the other person. You're trying to, part of conversation, trying to persuade the other person to come to your side, if you're on 2 different sides of a debate. And so we always want to kind of start every conversation with this idea of a charter of speech, these kind of boundaries laid out. And the third one simply is agree to disagree, and understand that that's the beauty of nature, is that we're all different. And this idea, and the plurality of humankind doesn't just extend to skin color or religion, rather also extends to the mind as well, right? I think all of us can agree that the next door neighbor to us, or even Akeel and me, are unique individuals in terms of our minds, right? There's, even though our families are literally from the same part of the world, same ethnicity, same background, same languages. Me and him, there's a lot of plurality on this camera. There's two separate individuals who think not completely, but possibly have completely different thoughts. However, should be respected as two separate individuals, and how we can enhance diversity of intellectualism, of intelligence, of thought, which I think is a bit more underrated. But maybe if we come across as our third point of our charter, which is understand that there is a diversity and a plurality of thought, and you can agree to disagree and understand that person is unique in their thought. And so we just wanted to kind of bring that up in terms of setting boundaries, in terms of maybe if our audience ever wonders how they can approach a conversation themselves. And like I said, we're learning here as well. And so this is something that kind of we sat down with informally, put together, and we said, maybe this would be a kind of a nice way to put the kind of frames around a conversation. And so that's exactly what we want to think about the charter of speech.
Yeah, so, just simply put, just reiterating, keep an open mind and understand that there are different perspectives to ideas and topics that you may not think of. Just know that it's there and just respect it. Yes, again, you don't have to agree with it, but just respect it and understand that it's there.
Mm-hmm.
And just moving forward, we can continue on.
Yeah, so, continuing from the power of speech, essentially, conversations are important, conversation between people, but maybe someone listening to this or watching this might be thinking, okay, I get you guys, but like 2020 was so bad and there's so much stuff happening and I didn't realize how complex things were. Is it just me, or did you feel like in 1 year you learned way more than you did in high school?
I did, for sure.
I feel like my entire life flipped over, like not just the negative parts, but I learned so much just from, maybe it's from the free time that we had.
Yeah.
But I feel like the education that we got in high school in 4 years essentially summarized itself in like 1 year. Yeah. Anyways, maybe someone might be saying, with all the negativity that just happened, and even if we're headed into the new world, how do you think people should be able to navigate like all these trends that we're going to be talking about? But how do you think, with all, it could, to some it might feel overwhelming, but maybe could you shine like a sort of silver lining around this?
Yeah, honestly, like I even started doing this myself too. Now that I have a little extra time, I honestly just look at headlines and try to find a topic to look into. For example, the other day I wanted to learn about cryptocurrency. I simply just put it in on Google and found, like an Investopedia article and just read through that slowly. Take your time, maybe read an article a day and just try to comprehend what's going on. And over time, all that knowledge will add up. You don't need to, learn everything all in one day. You have a lot of time, especially now with, especially in 2020 with the pandemic. But that's looking on the bright side. There's a lot of optimism because now we have stuff to look forward to, a whole new future, a whole new world, as we like to dictate it. Yes.
A whole new Aladdin. Shout out to Aladdin. Yeah. So yeah, I guess that's like another point I want to hammer home, is that I think there's never been another, even though doesn't seem like it, there's never been like a more exciting time to live. I think it goes both ways. I think it's like, to some it might seem like the end of the world, but to some, I think, and to me, although like naturally I'm kind of a very pessimistic person about the future of like our civilization, but personally I'm more of a realist, and I kind of think to myself that there's always a counterbalance to everything. And so to me, part of me, whether you call it blind optimism, I simply just think that there just naturally has to be some sort of like counterbalance. And so if you look at the other positive trends that are happening around the world, maybe because, like I said, where you get your news from, and possibly maybe not being able to take a bit of extra effort to study, you realize that there's been some amazing things happening. Like we saw like the trends happening in space exploration. We've seen amazing trends in biomedicine and biomedical engineering, and how really people for the first time are starting to look at people more different during the lockdown. There's more sense of like love in the world, and more sense of like compassion, and to approach things, like I said, from first principles, but at the same time to kind of engage with the other side. Even though it seems like everyone is fighting with each other, it could also be, like I said, just a compelling mainstream media news headline that you're watching that's giving you a reaction so that their advertising dollars can be paid, right? Versus in reality, you walk down the street, you're not really seeing every single block someone fighting with another person. Whereas but the news media will make you think that there's like someone every single block fighting with each other about like masks wearing or whatever. Like, I think there is a silver lining. The fact that there's like never before there's been much information. So much stuff has been democratized and open source in terms of learning. I think with the lockdowns, you also saw how education was differently approached, right? Not just our university education, which is being held over Zoom, but literally there's people, for those of us that took full advantage, there's plenty of people that we know in our circles, and I guarantee some of you guys know this too, to make completely huge transformation in 2020, who dedicated the time to grind and to actually work on things that they wanted to improve on themselves, along with investing some of their dollars and their time in learning new skills, and I guess accumulating more knowledge with regards to something that they were interested in and never did before because they never simply had the time.
Exactly.
And I think the lockdown, in its silver lining, if I can think of anyone's silver lining, it was this idea that sort of excuse, I would like to call it, which was I don't have time, kind of was taken away.
Exactly.
Exactly. And so I think people enjoyed the freedom for the first time, if you want to put it in that word, that now all the bondage was kind of broken apart. It's like, okay, like here you go. It's almost like nature was like pushing you at the front of the line. It's like, okay, what are you going to do now? Like, so I think that's kind of the silver lining. And I think many people took advantage of it. Certainly we did with the start of this brand. And we definitely appreciate that. We appreciate the fact that we were able to get together, brainstorm, go through the entire business process. As we mentioned from the beginning, it was a very difficult process at first.
Sure.
It was like kind of very late nights deciding, and there was a lot of work being put into this behind the scenes. Obviously, it's things that you guys will see or hear about. But there was like budgeting. There was more about business processes, learning about tax codes and stuff like that. And so all this stuff is important. But this was, like I said, this was the education that we received that we never got in high school.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, there was like plenty of learning opportunities, which is essentially the silver lining that I could think of, which was there was a lot to learn. There still is more to learn. And I think the future does look bright. I think this is definitely an amazing time to be alive. Things are going to get better from just the law of chance and the fact that, like, if when all seems lost, as although it's a cliche, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel.
And and those of you who really took advantage during this lockdown time and tried to start businesses or different projects, and even if you did fail, don't take it as a downfall or like I can't do anything. Look on the bright side and think about the experience that you gained and what you can put forward post 2020 and into the new world.
Yeah, I think we can give you a more practical example from our end, right? When we started our business processes, as Akeel mentioned, some of our equipment was faulty. So we had to like learn on the fly on how to position certain things and create a nice studio, a home studio, and really things that in real life, like I said, when you think about studios, you think of multi-million-dollar corporate buildings, and this is just in someone's house. And so we had to kind of take the steps to kind of create a more efficient, budget-friendly studio, because once again, we're a startup, we're young entrepreneurs, we're 19 years old, we're in university as well. And so this was an amazing learning opportunity for us. And I guess in terms of the failures, it wasn't necessarily a failure, but it was a setback. And I think people have to understand that there's going to be setbacks. And I think if people are expecting the world in any shape, way, or form, and if anyone, and I think people, necessarily our audience or ourselves, but I think people have to come with terms of the fact that setbacks are indeed just a part of the process. And I think it's a beautiful part of the process, because once things really start kicking off, you kind of look back at the setbacks and you're like, imagine if that setback didn't happen, I wouldn't have purchased this piece of equipment, or like I didn't realize how good quality this was, or maybe that setback really, they showed me like how to really approach particular guests or market to my audience or do some social media marketing. And so I think everything, like, in terms of its setbacks, lessons can be gained in terms of like how to put your time and dollars and money into investing in something that actually is worthwhile, that brings you a return. And
yeah, like I always like to think of that cliche quote, everything happens for a reason. And
for sure.
Those setbacks, like Areez was saying, could be a stepping stone to making it even better.
To definitely, like, we've definitely had our setbacks, and we're just beginning, and there's plenty more setbacks to come, and there's plenty more boulders to clear. But that's like I think the beauty of the journey, which is how we approach this podcast. As it goes back to the familiarization, the ability to relate, is that what we say is purely genuine, and we're not being fed any scripts, or there's no special interest groups, so there's no corporate press, there's no corporate media, and we're simply speaking from the heart, and we're speaking on a topic and an audience that we believed needed a void to be filled. And we want to be the ones, from your judgment, from your constructive criticism as customers and as listeners of a podcast, to give us, so that we can produce the best quality content of podcasting and of analysis and of actually conversation that you guys are investing your time in to listen to us. And so that's our goal, is to fill the void that so many other people have forgotten about, which is Gen Z, which is the positivity and also the critical thinking analysis of various topics that our generation often sometimes either doesn't do because of time, or is never really taught to do in school, or is simply just overlooked as being kind of pseudo intellectual work and not really like a thing that everyday people do. Whereas I think now more than ever, it's better that all of us think from first principles and rationality, so that we really get to the root of all these issues, right? We're headed into the new world. there's bound to be amazing things happening. At the same time, there's going to be new problems to tackle, and there's always going to be problems because there's always going to be a need for human ingenuity, human innovation, and really the best way to approach that is from rationality, from intellectualism, and from thinking, like I said, from discussions and conversations as to what doesn't work at the moment and how we can improve that. How can we innovate? Which is one of my favorite words to use: innovate, 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 innovate. Like everything will need to have had gone through an innovation process at some point. Things that we don't see right now, me and Akeel are not talking about. In 2 years, there might need to be an innovation in a particular industry. We've never seen it coming.
Exactly.
And we will never know entirely what the future holds. But the idea is someone has to start building it from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal, like we said, is to hopefully one person listening to this or watching this goes on to create an amazing project, goes on to get empowered by values of rationality thinking, of thinking from first principles, of the importance and the privilege that we have as Gen Z to be in a world where we have access to so much information. And although everything seems lost, it's an amazing time to be alive. It's an amazing time to take risk. It's an amazing time to build our future and to ultimately put the world in a direction and add just a little bit of good happiness and hope into the world and kind of leave it in a better place than we found it, which I think everyone's credo at the end of the day, which is that although we don't have like an infinite amount of time on the planet and in civilization and in the grand scheme of things, really from a morbid perspective, even though our life doesn't really matter in like the span of like evolutionary history, it's important to understand that despite that humbling scene that it doesn't matter, it should reinforce the idea even more that your actions every single day can contribute to building a better world for the generations to come and for the current world. So I think that's kind of like the hopeful message that we want to leave this podcast episode on. We thank you for tuning in today. For those of you watching on YouTube and for those of you listening on Spotify and SoundCloud, you can check out our audio experience over there. We're also going to be writing Medium articles and LinkedIn articles that correspond to every podcast episode. So for the first episode, the article corresponding will be released a few days after release of this podcast. And essentially what it will just cover will be themes discussed in the podcast, along with calls to action. And so we have a recurring segment here before we end the show, which is our 3 main takeaways, which essentially is we're going to ask our guests this, we're also going to ask each other this, and maybe summarize 3 key points that each of us did today. So I guess I'll start with my 3 points.
For sure, yeah, go ahead.
So my first 2 points, my first point is I took away that the power of individuals is really supreme, and it's not just governments, it's not just companies that trailblaze and break boundaries, it's individuals at the end of the day. So it's one individual with the hope and the aspirations that wants to take that risk for the rest of us to prosper. The second takeaway is that we're uniquely positioned in our time and place in history to really make change, whether it be and be positive, and to really understand that we have so much access to resources. And although it seems, and I think maybe I would reword my second one, is that there's always more to see than meets the eye. Is that although it all seems lost and all seems very depraved, it's never been this good ever in history. And there's many other problems to solve, yes, according to our time. But let's just accept the fact that there's always more to see than meets the eye, and it's never been so well before in history. And I guess my last point that I want to leave off with from an optimistic point of view is, like I said, just welcome to the new world. And this is how, whether there might be more months of lockdown or whatever the case may be, understand that it is always the free will of people that dictates how the world moves. And whatever their sinisterism or evil or establishment politics or whatever the case may be, there's always trailblazing individuals at the end of the day that are going to build our future forward, and everything has to move futuristically. There's no backing down at this point. We've passed the inflection point, we're headed in a curve and we're going for it. And just welcome to the new world. Let's build it.
Yeah, just going towards my 3 takeaways, I think my first one would really be just take the time to learn and get experience for your future. For me, my time management skills are really horrible, but fortunately, due to the whole lockdown phase, I was able to kind of work on it and try to squeeze in more time to learn about new things and just learn more experiences and how to act and behave and understand what's going on for our future. Because now's the time to practice. Practice makes perfect, and learning about it from now, going into the future when it's really in demand. For example, things like cryptocurrency. When all of a sudden, if that takes over regular currency, since you took the time to understand what it really is, now you're 1 foot forward. You're 1 step ahead of the rest of the people of the competition. My second takeaway would be take risks and just do what you have to do, innovate. Like one of my favorite role models is Henry Ford, who, if you guys don't know, was the inventor of the assembly line, which is why so many people are able to drive vehicles today, and why it's affordable to a lot of people. But had he not done that, our world would be completely different. And like Areez was saying, although our lives may not matter on like the whole evolutionary scale, the things we do affect the next generation, right? And that, I guess, leads to my third takeaway, which is ultimately try to just be optimistic, look on the bright side, and be open minded, be open to learning new perspectives, and overall just be ready to enter the new world.
Mm-hmm. So with that, we would like to bid you farewell. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week or next time on the next episode of this New World podcast.
Take care. Good luck on all your endeavors.
See you guys. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and share. Check us out for an audio-only experience on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other outlets. Follow us on all of our social media, and please consider supporting us on Patreon. All of these links will be in the description. That's it for us today. Welcome to the New World.